When it comes to animal experimentation, science has done things the same way for centuries. It's time for an update. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, the Research Modernization Deal. It's PETA's strategy, developed with its own team of scientists, to make science more ethical and responsible. That's especially true when it comes to using animals in experiments. Right now, 90% of basic research involving animals fails to lead to treatments for humans, a 90% failure rate. And the National Institutes of Health, NIH, spends more than $19 billion each year on what amounts to a wasted effort. What if that money could be diverted to experiments that may give real hope, like finding a cure for cancer, instead of funding cruel animal experiments that provide little to no value? Dr.Emily Trunnell is a scientist with PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department. She came to PETA after she realized, while getting her doctorate, that the prevailing scientific paradigm was cruel to animals and devoid of ethics. Now at PETA, she's working to make the Research Modernization Deal the new higher standard for science. Here's Dr. Emily Trunnell on the PETA Podcast.
I actually started my career doing animal experimentation in graduate school. I used mice and rats in experiments to study the way diet affects the brain. And I thought that I was doing something that was going to, lead to scientific knowledge, that, maybe it would use a few animals, but that would be worth the greater good or, for the greater good. But the more and more I did this, and the more I had to actually write papers to justify what I was doing, I realized, okay, these experiments maybe only apply to the very mice and rats that I'm experimenting on. And I came to know the animals as well as the individuals that they are. The mice and rats get a bad rep, but they are extremely intelligent, wonderful beings. So I just became, it became ethically problematic for me to keep doing what I was doing. And when I graduated, I knew I wanted to do something different. And I learned about all the great work that PETA was doing to end animal experimentation. And in that time, in the last 5 years, I've been able to be a part of that. And it's been, better than my wildest dreams.
It really was a transformation. When it happened to you, is it far-fetched to think that it should happen to everyone who undergoes that kind of PhD training, that they come to that stage and they say, what the heck am I doing to the animals? You
would hope so. Unfortunately, the industry of animal experimentation, everyone, the senior scientists, everyone who is indoctrinated in that paradigm, they work hard to indoctrinate you as well. You're taught to suffocate your empathy. You're taught that what you're doing, you're doing the hard work that other people wouldn't have the guts to do, but it's for this, greater cause of helping human health. And you're really sold that pretty forcefully from the people that you look up to, the people that you're supposed to model yourself after and admire, and who have achieved the kind of successes that you want to achieve. So I think it can be easy, and it was easy for me at times to believe those things. And I think a lot of people who do start to feel like they are doing something they don't want to do, like what they're doing to the animals is wrong, I think a lot of people that feel that way actually leave. They say I don't want to do this kind of research. Maybe they move to a different lab, or they're like, maybe science isn't cut out for me. And so that's really a detriment to science to have these compassionate people feeling like they wouldn't succeed because they don't want to contribute or participate in the cruelty. So I think that's something in the industry and the research paradigm that really needs to change, because we're pushing out some potentially, brilliant and compassionate people.
Well, that's the point. You're not just pushing out the brilliant ones, but you're pushing out the compassionate scientists, the ethical scientists. And now you're at this stage, 5 years at PETA, and you're not just dealing with your personal experiences and your transformation, as the transformation has happened, but now you see the facts, you see scientific fact, and it can't justify continuing on in the old way, it would seem, from the facts that you've compiled.
You're absolutely right. I was shocked to learn, and this isn't something I learned until I really got a chance to look at the big picture, and was able to do my own research and look into the research of others who have studied whether or not the animal research paradigm, whether or not using animals is actually benefiting humans. It wasn't until I came to PETA that I learned that 95% of new drugs that have passed animal tests, they've been shown to be safe and effective in all of the animal tests that were performed. 95% of those fail when they get to humans. I mean, what fails 95% of the time? And we're like, yes, let's put half of our U.S. research budget into that. And it's startling when you actually get a chance to look at the statistics. So, that's 95% of all drugs. It's even higher for some disease categories like Alzheimer's. The failure rate's 99%. Cancer, 96.6%. Sepsis, 100%. We haven't come up with any new sepsis treatments using animals. So I think most people would be really shocked to learn those figures.
I mean, it's such an incredible failure rate, and yet they continue. Is it justified to continue to go on in that path because you might strike gold somewhere, or you might find the one truth amongst the 99% of the failures, or the 95% failures? Or is it just at that point, do you have enough of a sample size to say you got to change course?
Yeah, using animals has been the predominant research paradigm for centuries now. I think that's enough, and especially when you consider the harms to animals. Animals are mutilated, burned, shocked, made to be depressed and anxious, not able to rear their own young, have their babies taken from them, killed, all sorts of horrible things. People who oversee animal experiments and who decide whether or not certain protocols can go forward are supposed to undertake a harm-benefit analysis. Do the harms to the animals outweigh the benefits to humans, or vice versa? And if you look at the data, it's clear that that's not being done. If harm-benefit analysis were actually done and done correctly, almost no experiments would be approved on animals.
So it's kind of like a rubber stamp, or not even, it's just ignored, the idea of doing a harm-benefit analysis. It's not done?
There's several problems with that. It is that some committees will just rubber stamp experiments. They don't want to question other experimenters, their peers. So they just go ahead and say, I'm sure that you know what you're doing, senior scientist X. Go ahead and use these 3,000 animals and do horrible things to them. I'm sure that you know what you're doing. So there's that problem. But there's also the problem that a lot of times, especially in the U.S., the people who are judging the harms and the benefits are in two separate camps, and they don't talk to each other. So the people that are supposed to assess what benefit might come from an experiment, those are people at the NIH who approve the grant funding. And the people who are assessing the harms of an experiment are at each individual institution, like Johns Hopkins or Texas A&M. That committee is supposed to be assessing the harms to the animals, but those two groups don't come together to weigh the outcome and decide which way the pendulum swings.
So it just keeps swinging the same old way it swung. Nothing gets done, or a lot of experiments get done, but nothing gets accomplished because they're failures. The experiments fail. Is there anything valuable that comes out of the experience of failure? Do they learn something from the failure? Except they don't seem to learn that animal experiments don't work. But is there something else that they value from the failure?
They get papers published and they get more grants funded. And that's the vicious cycle. You have to, once you get a grant funded, you have to publish those papers in order to get another grant funded. And you would hope that scientists who are supposed to be very intelligent people and using the scientific method would learn from those mistakes. But they seem to be so entrenched in the way that they know how to do things. I think for a lot of them, it's maybe scary to figure out how to do something, how to learn a new method that they've never used before. They've been using, mice their entire career. And that's something that the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, who's our largest funder of biomedical research in the world, could really take initiative to help change. NIH should be funding people for providing funding for people to learn these better human relevant methods, having specific grants for people who maybe are using animals but want to switch to using animal-free human relevant methods. And that's something that we've been calling on the NIH to do. And
so that seems to be the path. You got to reach NIH because they will dictate to the scientists who are just following what the paradigm suggests, and NIH is holding up the paradigm. So PETA has come up with this thing called the RMD.
Research Modernization Deal. Yeah, the RMD, the Research Modernization Deal. We kind of like to think of it as, the New Deal for research, or the Green New Deal when it comes to science, a way to really overhaul how we do scientific research in the U.S. and put it on the path that it needs to be on in the 21st century.
All right, but this sounds like it's kind of revolutionary in a way, right?
It is and it isn't. It's revolutionary in what it could accomplish, but the steps are actually very common sense, and it's a stepwise phase out. We're not looking to, put any out of a job. We have steps of our plan to where, if you are a researcher and an experimenter using animals, part of our plan is to help train you to do research in a better way. And it's just a very common sense strategy that would overhaul how we fund and conduct scientific research in the U.S.
All right. So basically, you would tell people to stop doing what they're doing if what they're doing leads to failure and waste?
Absolutely right. The first step of the Research Modernization Deal is a 5-step plan. And the first step is really simple. Stop doing what doesn't work. Stop funding research, or stop funding experiments on animals in the areas where we know very well that those experiments have not benefited human health. So some of the areas I mentioned earlier, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, cancer, the war on cancer has been going on for 50 years now, and, we have very little to show for it. Sepsis, addiction experiments, just areas where the scientific literature is clear that animal experiments have not led to benefits for humans or produced treatments or cures. So simply, the first step of the plan is just stop doing those things that don't work.
And then what's strategy point 2?
So strategy point 2 is to review additional areas of research where, maybe the literature is not explicitly clear and we don't know if animal experiments have helped. And that's one problem, Animal experiments are allowed to be funded and conducted without any sort of systematic evaluation of whether or not they're actually useful. So step 2 of our plan is to review all additional areas where animals are used and determine where they can be ended, additional areas where they can be ended immediately.
Perhaps this is where they might find those new possibilities, right? This is the to go where no one has gone before kind of thing, huh?
Exactly. When oversight bodies are rubber stamping animal experiments, even though better and more humane methods already exist are in use, that just can't be allowed to go on. That needs to stop.
All right. And I suppose, too, that you probably significant savings in these first two in terms of money that taxpayers fund.
A lot of the savings is going to come from not funneling money. Half of the NIH research budget is goes into animal experiments that aren't producing anything. so billions and billions of dollars, like $40 billion a year, I think, is the whole NIH budget. So billions of dollars saved from simply not doing things that don't produce useful results.
All right. Now, the third strategy point is this cost-benefit analysis or harm-benefit. What is that, and how can it be implemented so that it works and so that people do it and take it seriously?
So this step is crucial, especially when you consider, all the horrible things that happen to animals that are used in laboratories, which, listeners of this podcast will unfortunately know about all too well. So this step involves implementing an ethical harm-benefit analysis system. So essentially, this means, researchers, you have to run, not walk away from these experiments where the harm sustained by animals is so tremendous that no benefit to humans could ever justify it. I mean, we know this is every animal study. If you look at the data, this is every study. But there are areas where even the animal experimenters themselves acknowledge that, these should not be done anymore. Things like maternal deprivation experiments, torture to induce fear and depression, addiction experiments. This is an important step that I think the average person would think, of course we compare the harms and the benefits and make sure we're not doing anything, that would be so harmful yet provide no benefit. But it's not something that's done.
Would it be something like an environmental impact report that you would require from a developer who wants to go in and develop some land? Is it something like that you might be able to force a lab or scientist to submit or at least undertake so that we would see exactly where we were?
It's not a strange or off-the-wall ask. It's something that exists in other countries, and it's a standard that the U.S. should be held to as well. And
so, all right, that's a third and an important point, the harm-benefit or cost-benefit analysis. The fourth area about harmonization. You mentioned other countries, harmonization with other countries and other ways of doing science. Explain that fourth strategy point.
So a lot of what we've been talking about so far is, research for human diseases. This is called like basic or translational research. But there's also an area of research that's mandated by regulatory agencies to make sure that products are safe. And animal testing is used for this a lot, and it's not effective at, being health protective for humans. So our fourth step of this plan would be to achieve international acceptance of non-animal testing methods for toxicity testing. So I think it's pretty reasonable to think that if a test is approved in the U.S., it should be approved in France, India, and every other country. These tests, are important to show that products products are safe for humans and safe for the environment. But there are so many non-animal methods available that there's really no excuse for animals to suffer through these tests anymore. Animal experiments don't provide the data that we need to show that things are health protective for humans.
And then I suppose if there's international, the term that PETA uses, international harmonization, that means you wouldn't have to keep duplicating studies, that you could say if it worked in France, it's going to work in China, it's going to work in the U.S. Is that sort of the ideal?
Part of it is getting these tests accepted everywhere in the first place and making it so that, the standards that one country uses to validate and approve a test are are the same standards across the board so that every country, every regulatory agency feels comfortable with those decisions. And we just really want everyone to put their heads together, government agencies, industry representatives, and researchers to collectively develop and validate these tests, and an international strategy mandating them whenever possible.
And who would have the power to mandate everyone to be in harmony? Because it seems that you've had these ethical concerns here in the United States, and the paradigm has prevented you from really bringing people together. How are you going to impose this on an international paradigm or an international sense of how science is done?
Well, I've been talking about the Research Modernization Deal for the U.S., but we also have versions for the EU and India as well. And we are, working with our international affiliates to help those governments harmonize and bring everyone up to, the highest standard. And I think once that is done, then countries will feel comfortable with these sort of safeguards in place.
All right. So, that's the fourth pillar. And the fifth is redirecting funds from...
It's really simple. You increase funding for animal-free research and reduce funding for animal experiments. So this is really an area where the U.S. is falling short. The NIH is wasting billions, as we've talked about, on these archaic animal tests and really failing to invest enough in animal-free methodologies that could really actually fulfill its goal of helping humans. So it's a really simple step. 3 of the steps are pretty much stop doing what doesn't work and start funding what does work, which makes sense. And I think most people would agree with that.
And so when we talk about putting all these in action, the money's important, the billions, as you mentioned, that is the taxpayers fund, and it gets wasted. But how about in terms of the lives of the animals? Is there a number that you can say, well, if we did this, we could save X number of animals, or, these are the lives we'd save?
Some estimates have it into the hundreds of millions when you include mice and rats, which are not required to even be counted, despite the fact that they are 95% of the species that are being used. So potentially, once this plan gets put in place, it will result in a complete end to animal experiments. And that would save the lives of potentially hundreds of millions of animals every year.
All right. Now I'm talking to you. You seem reasonable. What is the reaction that doctors have when they hear the outline? And I'm talking about doctors and researchers on both sides. I guess the ethical ones would say, yes, this is exactly what we need. And then the other ones would say, sounds kind of what? What do they say?
We've actually had a lot of support for the Research Modernization Deal. So it's been endorsed by both the National Medical Association and the National Hispanic Medical Association, which together represent more than 100,000 doctors in the U.S. Our other scientists that we've collaborated on to actually come up with this plan and who have reviewed the plan really say that it, just like we've been talking about, it's common sense. You have to stop doing what doesn't work and start funding and doing what does work. So we have broad support across physicians, scientists, and even members of Congress for moving forward with this plan.
And is there one thing that when you meet someone who's skeptical, meet someone who says, I kind of like the old way, I like the old paradigm, is there something that you say that always will get people to at least stop and consider and be open-minded about a research modernization deal?
I mean, I'd say, consider how many times that you open a newspaper and you see that there's been a cure for cancer. And how many people do you know, or do you have friends of friends who have passed from cancer and other diseases? We are supposed to be funding research that helps save the lives of our friends and family and other people in this country and around the globe. And the data is so clear that experiments on animals just don't do that. And no one can really argue with that.
I think about how difficult it is to reproduce certain experiments. You might get a headline, you say, oh, this happened, but then there's no follow-up, and you realize later that it happened once, and it wasn't replicated, or they couldn't reproduce the same results.
You're absolutely right. One of those startling statistics that I mentioned, having learned since I came to PETA, was that up to 89% of experiments can't even be reproduced. So that's not talking about whether or not they translate to humans or produce treatments or cures that help humans. That's whether or not a result can be repeated from one lab to another, from one experiment to another. So 89% of the time, what you're finding out about, a monkey that you used in your study may not be true for the next monkey and the next cage over. And how are we supposed to expect that to translate? Not only is potentially science is being conducted poorly in these animal experiments, but if we can't replicate something in the same species, how are we supposed to expect it to translate to humans, a completely different species?
And so as listeners hear all this, what can they do to make sure that a research modernization deal is at least on the agenda for what should they do? Contact NIH, contact their Congress people, what?
On PETA's website, we actually have a really easy form set up where you can just go to PETA.org/RMD and write to your congressional representative and ask them to read PETA's Research Modernization Deal and compel the NIH to implement it. So we have a real easy form to fill out there where it goes straight to your congressional representative and encourage them to support the RMD.
Now, is there anything to be fearful of? I mean, is there anything in the RMD that would say, oh, this is hogwash science, this is not science at all? Or is there anything like that? Or what do you say to people?
Absolutely not. One of its strengths is that it is backed by so much evidence that comes from scientists themselves. You can read the list of 400 something references that we have in the RMD packet, and they're peer-reviewed, published studies showing that animal experiments have been failing, and we need to move quicker to shift our resources to animal-free methods. And the RMD provides a stepwise way to do that.
You've been at PETA 5 years. You transformed your scientific life. You see how the facts have come together to support and justify what you did, which is to become a more ethical scientist. How long might it take to bring even half of the research modernization deal to life?
Well, there are many things in the RMD that can be implemented right away. We can immediately stop funding experiments that aren't working. That's something that should already be happening. It's unconscionable to think how much taxpayer money is going into experiments that are just producing nothing useful. And that can be implemented right away. Shifting funding, creating new funding for researchers using animal-free methods and for researchers to learn animal-free methods, that can all be done right away. And some of the items involving toxicity testing, which is required by regulators, can be completed within the next 5 to 10 years. So it's really very quickly and strategically, a lot of these things can be implemented.
Well, Dr. Emily Trunnell, I appreciate you being on the PETA podcast to let us know about the Research Modernization Deal, the RMD, and I hope that people will heed your words and go to the PETA website and contact their members of Congress. So thanks, Emily.
Thank you, Emil.
Dr. Emily Trunnell is a scientist with PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department. Find out more about the Research Modernization Deal. Go to PETA.org for more. Contact NIH and your member of Congress and demand the change for the animals now. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or see my vlog at AMOK.com, or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's at ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show as well as subscribe to the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.